Hi all, this is Steph Giordano with Human Services Research Institute, and welcome to the very last of our NCI AD refresher trainings for 2018-19. Here we're going to talk about the use of proxies and some best practices for conducting the NCI AD surveys. So let's talk a little bit about proxy assistance, when you can use proxies, and who can serve. So establishing the need for a proxy, and when I say the need for a proxy here, I really mean establishing the need to have a proxy complete the full survey, so that full proxy version of the survey, meaning that the individual receiving services really is not going to be able to answer questions. So this can only be done in person. We do not want you to make a determination that you'll need a proxy to complete the full survey over the phone when you're scheduling the meeting, or have a perhaps family member or staff person say, the person's really not going to be able to answer any questions, and set up a proxy version of the survey then. We really need you to be in person speaking with the individual to determine whether they're going to be able to answer any of the questions throughout the consumer survey. So you'll always need to attempt those first 8 or so questions with the individual, those questions about home and relationships. So if in asking those first 8 questions, the person's able to reliably respond to those questions, or most of the questions, you can go ahead and proceed with a full version of the consumer survey. Again, keep in mind that it's absolutely okay if you think that maybe throughout the survey the person's going to need a little help remembering maybe some information. That's absolutely fine. The person can have help throughout the survey for those questions that are allowed to be answered by a proxy to get the help that they need. If the person, after having asked those first 8 questions, really is unable to reliably respond to any of the questions, that's really the only time that we're going to switch to the full proxy version, so where you'd only talk to a proxy if the person is unable to really understand or give responses to any of those questions 1 through 8 about the home and relationships. In Odessa, so if you're entering survey information in the online data entry system, Odessa, that appropriate response or survey will pop up based off of how you answer that question about the proxy respondent. So what happens more frequently in surveys than having a proxy who completes that full proxy version of the survey is that an individual will be able to answer some or most of the full version of the survey and just need a little bit of help getting through some of the other questions. So if that's the case, the individual can absolutely request to have a proxy help throughout the survey. You just want to make sure that the survey is only giving answers to those questions that have that gray proxy box. When a proxy is helping the individual, again, you'll be using the full version of the survey. You do want to make sure that you're still directing all of the questions to the individual. Try and make sure that the proxy doesn't start to talk over the individual or give answers before the individual has time to give their answers. Any question that does not have that gray proxy box can only be answered by the person who's receiving services. So as you're going through the survey, if the proxy has been giving a couple of answers, you'll just want to make sure when you get to a question where only the individual can answer, you let both the proxy and the individual know ahead of time that now this is only for the person who's getting services. Throughout the survey, where there are proxies who are allowed for a question, you do have that respondent box. You just want to make sure that you code who's answering each question where a proxy is allowed. A little more on establishing the need for a proxy. So again, I've been saying this, but please do not overuse the proxy survey. You are only using that survey if the individual is not able to answer any questions in the consumer survey on their own. It's again totally okay if the person is able to answer just some of the questions in the full version of the survey and get help on some others. We do recommend, if the individual feels that they're going to need a proxy for the meeting, to make sure that that proxy is available at the time of the meeting, and be sure that all of the schedules kind of align when you're setting up the meeting time. And of course, use the appropriate survey to complete the survey meeting, so have both a full and proxy version of the survey if needed. Just a note here, interpreters are not considered proxies. So it may be the case that a person needs an interpreter either to interpret to a different language, or maybe just to facilitate some conversation, and that's absolutely okay. That person would not be considered a proxy respondent. They're simply there to facilitate conversation between you and the individual. So those who can serve as a proxy has to be somebody who knows the person really well. As you all know, and we've kind of gone back over the survey, the questions that can be answered by a proxy are still questions that can only be answered by somebody who really knows the individual well, who knows their daily schedule and has a bit of history with the individual. Should, of course, be somebody who the person trusts and feels comfortable around. And who's really willing to respond on behalf of the individual, so not necessarily just giving their opinions and their thoughts about services and supports, but really is able to speak to the experience of the person receiving services. Most often, a proxy will be the person's child, a spouse or partner, a family member, a friend, or a paid or unpaid caregiver. Now, paid caregivers are not the ideal person to serve as a proxy respondent, but sometimes that's going to be the person who's available, and that's totally okay if needed. The only person who cannot serve as a proxy will be the person's case manager or care coordinator, and that's really just to avoid any kind of conflict of interest. So a little bit more about some surveying skills. A lot of this we've sort of covered as we talk through the survey, and again, things that you all should be doing in the field already, but these are important tips and reminders for conducting the survey in the field. So be sure to create a positive environment, a space where the person feels really comfortable giving their thoughts and opinions. Taking a minute to say hi, doing some icebreakers with the person is really helpful. This can help inform some of the questions that you might be asking a little bit later, and again, just makes the person feel a little bit more comfortable and at ease. And making sure that you do remind the person of all of those important things like participation is voluntary, that answers are confidential, and services are not affected by their participation. As much as possible, you want the person to decide when and where to hold the meeting, so where they're going to feel most comfortable. You want to try and find a quiet space that's comfortable to meet, so avoiding high traffic areas, living rooms, kitchens, places where people might be coming in and out. And of course, you only want to meet in a bedroom if that's the only space where the person has kind of a private space. But if this is the case, you'll of course want to leave the door open. And as much as possible, avoid having too many people present at the meeting. So you want to avoid having service people and family and others who might make the person feel a little uncomfortable giving their real thoughts and opinions about some of the questions that we ask. So you do want to practice. We know that you've been out in the field and conducted these surveys in the past, but the survey has changed slightly, and you've also been out of the field for a short time. And so it's a good idea just to refamiliarize yourself with the survey before you get out into the field, and that will help you make this more conversational for the individual as well. It's really important to be aware of the tone and quality of your voice. So making sure that you're speaking in a way that people can understand, can hear. You want to make sure that you're not speaking too quickly, and also giving people the opportunity to kind of let you know how they best would understand and hear you. Really important here, if a person is hard of hearing, of course we never shout. It is helpful to speak in a lower tone of voice if possible. That can help people better hear what you're saying. Conversely, higher pitches can be harder for people to hear. For those who may read lips, you want to speak in just a regular, steady pace. Position yourself so the person can see you, and do avoid wearing lipstick, which can distort the ability for a person to read your lips. Of course, really important here is to always be patient, give people time to think about their responses. You never want to start jumping in and giving people rephrasings and examples if they're just trying to think through their response. This can be really helpful when you do some introductions, just to ask the person a couple of questions that can help you better understand how the person will think about questions and how they maybe will respond. So maybe some people will take a few beats before giving a response. Other people might start talking and then kind of get to a response eventually. So just taking a minute to know that ahead of time is really helpful here. We've talked about this quite a bit, but never assume you know the response to a question. If the person gives you a response that doesn't fit neatly into one of our response options, you do want to do some following up. You, of course, would never skip a question and just kind of check off what you think the person would say. Always ask all of the questions to the individual and take their responses. We just finished talking about proxy respondents, but just a reminder again not to overuse that proxy version of the survey. Know when to use a translator versus a proxy. So again, it is absolutely okay to have somebody facilitate conversation between you and the individual. That person would not serve as a proxy. They would just serve as a way to have that person understand what you're asking and for you to understand what the person is answering. And always direct questions to the individual regardless of who's present at the meeting. This last point we really have not discussed very much, and I think it's really one of the more difficult aspects of doing these surveys, which is to remain neutral. This is really crucial just to the validity of the survey, to make sure that people don't feel that they're answering in ways that are right or wrong. We don't want people to start to feel like they need to seek out a certain validation from how you maybe respond to one of their responses. We also don't want people to feel as though the responses that they're giving you are making you feel badly, which may make them feel like they need to change some of their responses. So again, remaining neutral is absolutely key here. So that takes us to the end of this fourth refresher training module. So really briefly, what we went over here is how to determine whether to use a full or proxy version of the survey, so establishing the need for a proxy respondent, who can serve as a proxy, and then we just concluded with some best practices for conducting the survey meeting. So with that, we are done with our refresher trainings for 2018-19 for the NCI AD Consumer Survey. Thank you all so much for your attendance, for listening in on these trainings, and enjoy surveying this year. Thanks so much, guys.